What have we learned so far? In the first video, we have seen how technology evolves over time. We have discussed the three fundamental laws and how they translate into falling transaction cost. Then, we saw the impact this has on the broad business architecture of some industries. We specifically talked about the phenomena Philip Evans calls the deconstruction of value chains, something that we will come back to later. For now, let's go one layer deeper and ask the question, how does technology impact the performance of specific companies, if at all? We will start with the famous paradox, usually called the Solow computer paradox, for Robert Solow. He is a Nobel Prize laureate in economics, and he has been quoted saying, "You can see the computer age everywhere, but in the productivity statistics." This is a very powerful claim, very controversial, but it is not completely unjustified. In fact, when you look at the productivity growth in the last decades, you see that it has not kept pace with the growth in information technology spending. What I mean by information technology spending here is the total corporate investments in hardware, software, data centers, networks, and the related human resources. This amount is nearly $6 trillion per year. And it grew by a factor of almost 20 between 1980 and 2015. In the same time frame, global GDP barely tripled. This is exactly what the paradox refers to, inferring that technology investments didn't help us create more economic value. For any company or any rational economic agent, this would mean they should stop such investments. And I guess you see why the initial claim is a paradox, because both intuition and practice are going against its natural conclusion. So far, I have not yet met a CEO whose turnaround plan starts by stopping all IT spending and going back to the 1920s process manual. Now, before going any further in the course, I want to take time to establish with you that for companies, technology is a massive value creation lever. And I will split this discussion into two parts. First, theoretical, and then empirical. The theoretical discussion, I will go in there one by one through the most important attempts to solve Solow's paradox. First attempt. Maybe technology had a beneficial impact, just not on economic productivity, not on GDP, which is a very narrow measure. Second attempt, maybe it had a positive impact on GDP, but it will only show after a long time lag. Third attempt, maybe it had a positive impact on GDP and in the short term, but it was neutralized by some other business phenomena. Let's start with the first measurement argument. Most of us would agree that technology has obvious social and emotional benefits. My mother could see and talk to my daughter anytime, despite the two of them being 11,000 kilometers apart. But I would argue that work productivity benefits are equally obvious, at least at the individual level. Just look at the time it took to design mechanical components a few decades ago. You needed to solve complex differential equations by hand with a series of approximations to know how the component will behave under this or that kind of pressure. Now you run this through a numerical model in literally a few seconds. This has led to more efficiency, stronger risk management, and ultimately it led to better and more innovative, more value-adding products. So, although GDP is a narrow measure, it is fair to expect that technology impact would at some point trickle down there. Moving to the second argument, if we accept that technology had a productivity impact, maybe it doesn't show immediately because it simply takes time. This is a reasonable expectation. In every massive change, we should expect that only a small fringe of a company or of society would be early adopters. For those who have run large-scale transformation programs before, you know that it takes time to get the majority on board, to convince and train employees to use new technology or a new process. And even after that, it takes time for those employees to be fully productive with the new tools. This might also explain the delayed bump in productivity growth we saw in the late 1990s. And it would mean that we are already in times where technology impact is visible. Now, the third argument is a bit more subtle. It goes something like this. If we accept that technology had a positive productivity impact, that it is visible today, maybe the reason we didn't see it is that there are other factors impacting productivity, but this time negatively, in such a way that the total measured impact is neutral. If you are thinking what factors might have such an impact, there is one that comes naturally to mind: complexity. As an illustration, today, on average, companies set themselves 6 times as many performance requirements as they did in 1955. Back then, CEOs committed to between 4 and 7 performance imperatives. Today, it's between 25 and 40. And actually, many of those requirements can be contradicting. When it was enough for a car to be safe in the 50s, today it needs to be also innovative, cheap, have a good brand name, easy to maintain, and have tons of functionalities. So the increased complexity in business environments might have neutralized the positive impact of technology on productivity measures. To summarize the theoretical discussion, the solo computer paradox doesn't refute the positive impact of technology. It points out that part of this impact is non-productivity related, that it can be delayed in time, and that it is covered by the negative impact of increased complexity in today's companies. Before we move into the empirical discussion, I would like to share a story highlighting its importance. I was having a discussion with the management team of an Asian central bank, precisely on the impact of technology. After debating the 3 arguments and spending some time on how complexity is really changing the regulation of markets, the deputy governor asked a thought-provoking question. Isn't technology itself what creates the complexity it is trying to counterbalance? Well, although I don't completely agree, I can see how part of the complexity is enabled by the fact that consumers are now able to compare competitors across markets, that employees are expected to master more and more tools, and that managers are juggling new channels of communication and coordination. This is where the empirical side is key. We won't reverse the technology trend even if we establish how much complexity it creates, simply because it is compensated by the value creation potential. What value does this digital technology create for a business, empirically speaking? There are multiple studies researching this very topic. And the answers, of course, vary by industry and depend on the starting position of specific companies. In a BCG perspective published last year, we saw a positive correlation between technology investments and gross margins. Top-performing companies tend to have a higher technology intensity index compared to their industry average. These results go in line with another Harvard Business Review study focused on financial services industry, where digital leaders outperform digital laggards in customer loyalty and ultimately in revenue growth. This holds true for small and medium enterprises as well. A 2013 BCG study found that technology adoption leaders outperform laggards by 13 percentage points in yearly revenue growth. This was in developed markets. In emerging markets, that number is 15 percentage points per year. This can help many of you build more than solid business cases for your next technology investment plan. Let me now recap the most important messages from this video. Although we don't necessarily see it in productivity numbers, digital technology does have a visible impact on business performance. Some of this impact can be neutralized by the increased complexity generated by competition, customer demand, or regulation. Lastly, in practice, making the right technology investments translates into higher profitability and higher revenue growth, double-digit higher.
Vâng, con biết rồi.
Complexity generated by competition, customer demand, or most important messages from this video. Although we don't necessarily see it in productivity numbers, digital technology does have a visible impact on business performance. Some of this impact can be neutralized by the increased complexity generated by competition, customer demand, or regulation. Lastly, in practice, making the right technology investments translates into higher profitability and higher revenue growth, double-digit higher.
Quyền của ông. Cắn ra đã. Nào. Cắn xuống nào. Ôi. Chết rồi, sao lại nghịch cái đấy con? Đấy, nó cắn vào tay bây giờ.
Có đau không?
Sao đây? Bà phẫu.
Let's discuss a company undergoing a digital transformation, Pitney Bowes. For nearly 100 years, they have produced postal metering and processing equipment. A member of the S&P 500 since the S&P's inception, Pitney Bowes has long been a global leader in postal services and one of the most successful U.S. companies during the 20th century. Their challenge is obvious. What is the role of a postal services company in a digital age? In the following segment, we will hear about Pitney's digital journey toward becoming an e-commerce company. You will hear from senior leaders from Pitney Bowes about the challenges and opportunities of digital transformation.
Ôi, sợ quá. Ôi, sợ quá.
Bố lại đi đâu á? Đi tập à?
Pitney Bowes began almost 100 years ago. It was principally focused on mailing mail meters, if you will. And that really anchored the business and the strategy up into the 90s. In the
Chồng anh đó nha,
90s,
không phải là
for
ấy
a
đâu.
host of different reasons, the business became, I would say, equally focused on financial services. So there was, for sure, a aspect of financial services around the core mailing business. So part of the mailing equipment needs to be leased. And then there's also a bank that goes along with our core mailing business because many customers will actually want to prepay mail. So you need some function, some capability to actually take deposits and then make loans. So if you look at Pitney Bowes up until, I would say, 2000, it was kind of those two pillars. And I would say around the year 2000, and I think it's worth noting, at least I find it interesting, the 1999 Jim Collins book, Good to Great, one of my favorite management books, he talked about 12 companies, and Pitney Bowes was one of those 12 companies. And I'll come back to that in a moment because I think it's interesting. Around 2000, the company realized that with digital technologies, that the traditional mail market was going to come under pressure. So they went on a fairly aggressive acquisition spree. They spent almost $3 billion on 100 acquisitions over the next 8 or 9 years. And they were kind of all over the place. There wasn't really, at least coming into it after the fact, a level of coherency that you could really discern. But what happened, and I would say a little bit of good luck. So the financial services aspect of the business, they got out of kind of, I would say, the peripheral businesses in 2005, 6, 7. So they were into jet engines. They were into all kinds of different leasing vehicles. But they got out of that before the financial crisis. But come 2008, when the economy really hit the skids, Pitney Bowes began to have problems, and it was, it was even more acute because of the acquisitions had really kind of put a lot of pressure on the balance sheet. And then with 2008, the financial crisis, companies just stopped mailing. So they had kind of a perfect storm, if you will. So at the outset, we were pretty limited. It had to be in-house. So we had these businesses, and we settled on a handful. Pitney Bowes began almost 100 years ago. It was principally focused on mail meters, if you will. And that really anchored the business and the strategy up into the 90s. In the 90s, for a host of different reasons, the business became, I would say, equally focused on financial services. So there was, for sure, a aspect of financial services around the core mailing business. So part of the mailing equipment needs to be leased. And then there's also a bank that goes along with our core mailing business because many customers will actually want to prepay mail. So you need some function, some capability to actually take deposits and then make loans. So if you look at Pitney Bowes up until, I would say, 2000, it was kind of those two pillars. And I would say around the year 2000, and I think it's worth noting, at least I find it interesting, the 1999 Jim Collins book, Good to Great, one of my favorite management books, he talked about 12 companies, and Pitney Bowes was one of those 12 companies. And I'll come back to that in a moment because I think it's interesting. Around 2000, the company realized that with digital technologies, that the traditional mail market was going to come under pressure. So they went on a fairly aggressive acquisition spree. They spent almost $3 billion on 100 acquisitions over the next 8 or 9 years. And they were kind of all over the place. There wasn't really, at least coming into it after the fact, a level of coherency that you could really discern. But what happened, and I would say a little bit of good luck. So the financial services aspect of the business, they got out of kind of, I would say, the peripheral businesses in 2005, 6, 7. So they were into jet engines. They were into all kinds of different leasing vehicles, but they got out of that before the financial crisis. But come 2008, when the economy really hit the skids, Pitney Bowes began to have problems, and it was, it was even more acute because of the acquisitions had really kind of put a lot of pressure on the balance sheet. And then with 2008, the financial crisis, companies just stopped mailing. So they had kind of a perfect storm, if you will. So at the outset, we were pretty limited. It had to be in-house. So we had these businesses, and we settled on a handful of markets that we thought were markets that were logical for us to be in, i.e. we had brand permission. We had some type of competitive edge, and there were growth markets. So the markets that we settled on were location intelligence, customer information management, content management. We still kept the digital mailbox, although that was a little bit beleaguered at that point. And then this very small business, which we called global e-commerce at the time, which was a $5 or $10 million business that was really a single relationship with eBay. So those were the growth bets. Those half dozen businesses were the growth bets. So we worked hard to begin to innovate in those spaces. But at the same time, we were also trying to innovate in our core. And the way I've always thought about innovation is in 3 dimensions. There's business model innovation, there's product innovation, and there's process innovation. And we used all 3. So from a process innovation perspective, partially because the company had acquired so much different stuff and was run as a federated group of businesses, we had 37 different general ledgers. We had 5 different CRM systems. We had multiple service systems. We had multiple proprietary leasing systems, which very few people in the company understood. So the first really important point of innovation for us was what could you do on business process. So the intent was pretty simple, and that was to consolidate all of your business processes. So you had single processes for the entire company that were supported by contemporary technologies. So that was the first aspect of innovation. It was important for all kinds of reasons, some of which we understood at the time, some of which we've understood subsequently. But one of the key reasons it was important was it's provided $150 or $200 million of expense savings that we could begin to redeploy into innovation of products and innovation in other places. From a business product perspective, we began to innovate hard on those 5 or 6 areas. And I would say we were one of the interesting things about our digital businesses, our software businesses, is we had great customers. So there were $400 million worth of revenue. So it wasn't a huge business, but if you look at the client list underneath it, we had 90% of the Fortune 500. So we didn't, at that point, have a great marketing function. So we went to our key clients and we said, how can we help you innovate? What problems around the products and the domains that we're participating with can we begin to innovate for you? And that really began to kind of anchor the product innovation. And then we started on 2 business model innovations, one which yielded pretty quick results and one that took a while. But in our global e-commerce business, that was really kind of a platform business in the sense that it is a business platform that has all the attributes of a business platform. And that is, if you can get enough volume through it, it scales nicely. So it happened that I had a good relationship with eBay from my previous career at IBM, and I knew the CEO well. So I went out there and I asked John, so what could we do to really take this to another level? And that began the growth of global e-commerce, which to some extent has been the engine for growth of the company over the last 4 or 5 years. In parallel, we began this kind of crazy development project in our core. So if you remember, we had 3 pillars of strategy. The first was stabilize our core business. So all of a sudden we called that reinvent our core. So if you think about what the mail meter was, it was a monolithic, single application, analog device that really the mechanical engineering hadn't changed too much in the last 100 years. So we said, what if you could evolve that business to a platform business of its own so that the device would become a utility, but a multi-application utility that would certainly do the evidencing of mail, but would do shipping and do lots of other applications as well. So you begin to create all new sets of possibilities and value propositions for these million clients that you had, that they, along with us, were experiencing this melting iceberg because the value of mail was going down. So that began, in 2013, and those 2 aspects of innovation around business model are the most exciting aspects of innovation going forward.